Hello, and welcome to the weekly Friday voice chat of the Men Are Human Discord. We are the semi-official Discord of the Men's Rights subreddit. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about how homeless shelters often discriminate against not just men, but even boys. How boys as young as 13 and 14 are turned away and forced to live on the streets. This encapsulates the more general notion of male disposability, where male victims of domestic violence and homeless men are not given the same kind of consideration and care. This is part of the picture of the male empathy gap, where society does not seem to view male victims of domestic violence and homeless men equally to female victims of domestic violence and homeless women. This is a common practice, though. Believe it or not, in the US, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, many times if a mother shows up with her 12 or 13-year-old son, that 12 or 13-year-old son will be turned away from the shelter because he is a boy, and thus he is seen as dangerous and he is seen as a threat. And so you get a lot of homeless teenage boys and young teenage boys, 14, 15 years old, wandering the streets because they are turned away. And so a lot of countries like the UK claim that they have some great social security blanket, or they have this security net, but they don't, because they allow 14 and 15-year-olds to remain homeless and on the streets just because of their gender. So there's a big gap in society of how we do not treat homeless men and we do not treat male victims of domestic violence the same way. And it's not only that we treat them less than female victims, we don't treat them at all. In a lot of countries, there's no system that helps them, and they're given literally nothing. Even as young as 13 years old, a 13-year-old boy in the UK would get less welfare than a 30-year-old woman if they were both on the streets. So boys are treated as more, I guess, self-sufficient and less vulnerable than a 30-year-old woman. So a preteen male is seen as less vulnerable than a fully grown adult woman. And these are practices that feminist organizations routinely support. The Fawcett Society in the UK directly campaigns for gendered laws when it comes to domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters. So when feminists say they support men too, and they support equality, how exactly can you say that you think men and women are equal if you think a 13-year-old boy isn't just equally capable to a 30-year-old woman, but more capable? So that's kind of the topic today. I know Ma has some good links on this topic. This is something that happens in many countries around the world, and this is something that affects many people around the world. And it's pretty scary because you have to think, if you can take a 13-year-old and a 30-year-old and say the 13-year-old boy is more capable than a 30-year-old woman, then does that lead to a slippery slope when it comes to things like the draft or conscription or healthcare or welfare services or retirement, where males are put in a different social category legally under law than females?
The average age that they seem to stop boys from entering these shelters is like 11. And we have basically we've discovered that it's not just that. We've found plenty of shelters where they don't allow boys aged 9, and we've found a few shelters where they don't allow boys aged 4 or 5. Like, so if the boy can talk, the boy is not allowed in the shelter. And now you can make a case that some of these shelters are in fact dormitories. So if there's a boy aged 12 and up, then that can be a problem with privacy and things like that. But I think that's something that can easily be solved by hanging up sheets and things like that. They managed to solve these problems, in hospitals and things like that, where they just put up like a cheap piece of fabric across the area, and then that's perfectly also private. But like, we have several articles showing that abused boys are going from abused families onto the streets because they have nowhere else to go. They're forming, sometimes they're forming little communities of boys where they are slumming it together. But you have to realize that a lot of these boys are getting picked up by other abusers. So, generally speaking, if a boy is abused and he ends up on the streets, then he then has a high probability of either being abused again in some other way, being dragged into prostitution, being dragged into drugs, being dragged into organized crime, because young boys are actually an extremely hot property when it comes to burglary, because you can fit a young boy through a very tight window and then they can go around and unlock the door for them. I mean, they've been doing this for hundreds of years. It's almost a traditional thing. And so many other things. They end up running drugs, they end up in all sorts of things. So by not allowing boys, this is having a knock-on effect in society, which is also harming them again and again, and it's also harming other people. It's not a good situation.
We're not on the slippery slope. We've fallen off the cliff already, and I would argue, having listened to Aaron Pizzi and the aggression women have when they're at such a vulnerable stage of having been abused, it is a lot safer for a boy to not be there, but they do need to be they do need to be taken care of by a decent organization. I would argue that the other women beside the mother are a danger to such children, and definitely male children. Because they're abused and they're going through trauma, and they can be aggressive in going through trauma. And that's, I mean, yeah, that's horrible, but that's normal. That's how people deal with things sometimes.
I mean, I find it extremely shocking that there are shelters which don't allow young boys under the age of 11. You can't really make a case for them not allowing teen boys, but primary school boys. It's a crazy thing. Like 4-year-olds, you can't have a 4-year-old boy in there. You can have a 4-year-old girl.
I would argue they should have like a separate daycare, or like kind of an orphanage is like this, like steadings basically for the kids of these abused women. Or, well, I would like male abuse shelters as well, but I think they should have separate facilities for the children, but they should definitely have facilities for kids in abuse shelters, because they're kids, they can't take care of themselves, and why would you disallow them to be there because they have a penis? And that is just blatantly sexist.
Nobody seems to really be paying attention to this. Nobody seems to be like at all interested in that these shelters are doing this. I mean, obviously, they're even less interested in the fact that these government-funded shelter organisations exclude men and force men to start charities which then aren't government-funded in order to help these men. I mean, we did come across a couple of men's shelters while doing this, and we saw nothing on them about any kind of exclusion of young girls on them. There was nothing about that as far as I could see on any of these male shelters. But well, I'll just show you some of the screenshots, and you'll maybe start to get an idea of just how many of these shelters exclude boys.
Really wrap your minds around the fact that discrimination against boys, when it comes to something like basic shelter and survival, starts as young as 11. And feminists want to say that we live in a patriarchy where men are privileged. 11-year-old boys are turned away from basic shelter. I mean, just think about that. I mean, try and imagine that with the genders reversed. You couldn't. It would never, ever happen. Just imagine like the Red Cross or any charity or the UN saying we will help 11-year-old boys but not 11-year-old girls. It's unimaginable. You would never see that happen. And yet it happens every single day in so-called first world progressive countries. Just because you were born male, it means that by age 11, 12, 13, you get discriminated against. It's completely insane. And the fact that people still say we live in a patriarchy or that men privileged gender just absolutely does not match up at all with reality.
But yeah, they are excluding literal children. If you look in those links, you'll see one of them says no boys over 5 years. We got one that says no boys over 4 years. It's a very, very common thing, and there's generally no explanation given. The only one that explained it was saying something like no boys over 12 years because it's a dormitory. But it's, I mean, they say no girls over 17 years in some of them. But at the same time, most of those places where they say no girls over 17 could put in the 17-year-old as a separate domestic violence survivor case and give them a bed anyway, so that they would still be right in there, in the shelter there. Now, just imagine for a second, you're escaping abuse, like actual abuse. The husband is actually, or possibly the wife, because like lesbian relationships can be violent as well. And as far as stats go, they can be the most violent. But imagine that you're escaping abuse, really awful abuse, with your boys, and you go to the shelter and they say the boys can't come in. Like, they'll take the woman, they'll take the young girls, but the boys can't come. And so you've got two choices. You can either go home to an abusive relationship, which could possibly be a lethal relationship. Like, he could be on the verge of killing her, or she could be on the verge of killing her. And then she's got to choose between leaving the boy outside on the doorstep and going back to that.
Really?
Yeah, that's just reality. We this is all over the world as well. We have citations from France as well, where this was happening.
You said
No,
that 5-year-olds were excluded. Like
yeah, just
5.
look through the screenshots.
No boys. 14. We must see children for up to 3 weeks. Oh my god. 5 years. Why 5? You think
We don't
5-year-old
know.
can just...
I mean, five,
You think
5 years old, and you're already guilty for being born a male. 5. That's kindergarten is 6. First grade is 6, but that's around kindergarten or first grade. I mean,
5-year-old
kindergarten.
can't even do a part-time job to sustain himself.
I mean,
A 5-year-old has to eat food from garbage because of
just
this.
think that 10 years old is double 5. So imagine how young 10 years old is, and they're saying that someone half that age shouldn't come to a shelter. Half of 10 should not come to a shelter. It's evil.
And you know what's even worse? They're only going to keep on decreasing and decreasing the age of boys being able to go into those abuse shelters. I mean, what's next? Like, the woman's pregnant and she's carrying a boy? Like, that's probably how it's going to end up being, which that's sad on both accounts. But why? I mean, why is this happening?
We don't know.
Because it's easy to ignore problems that don't affect you in the day-to-day life. You know, people turn on the news and they see there was a bombing in the Middle East, or that there's starvation in the third world country, and they just kind of ignore it because it's not really affecting them. And so these kinds of issues are things that they see on the TV, but not really affecting them in the day-to-day life. And it's kind of human nature to ignore the things that ignore you. And these kinds of issues ignore most people. Most people don't have to worry about this. But those people that do have to worry about it, those people that do have those circumstances, have to live it every single second of every single day, and they are completely ignored, and society completely shuts them out. And so then feminists wonder, well, how come men start a men's rights movement? Why are there men that do this kind of thing? Because it affects us every single day. There are thousands and millions of men and boys who are affected by these issues every single day. And they are MRAs because they have to be. They have to fight for their issues. They have to fight for their rights because their lives are at stake. They don't have a choice. It's not just going on Twitter and leaving some, edgy opinion. It's about eating that night. It's about having shelter that night. They have to care. They have to fight for it. They have to be MRAs because if they don't, they die. And
And
so it's very easy.
Mom made a very good point. Mothers that have sons should not have to choose between going back to an abusive partner or letting the son be open and vulnerable to possibly to abusive people as well. Like that, this is bad on all accounts because not only are you harming the mother, which can potentially harm the children even further, but also you are basically saying that because you are basically painting that the son is gonna end up like the dad too, like. And so you're just you're basically separating a mother from her child. And
A
that's
lot of
heartbreaking.
a lot of extreme feminists will actually say that boys are just trainee abusers and trainee murderers.
Well, in my experience, I have experienced more abusive women than I ever have experienced abusive men. So that statistic is false.
But it's
At least
like
we know that. Well, at least we know that this homeless shelter, at least in America, I don't know about India. At I, it is at least like confirmed. It is matriarchal, opposite of patriarchy. Like this.
All I gotta say is this is the worst patriarchy ever. If we're, getting away with a bunch of stuff that we shouldn't be getting away with because of so-called patriarchy. Worst patriarchy ever, right, men?
yeah,
It's more of a gynocentric.
Patriarchy is in Middle East, I guess, in African countries, I guess, where
In other
then
countries,
FGM is
yeah,
where
like in other
FGM is like
countries,
legal.
yeah. Like in other countries, obviously in the Middle East, there are obvious forms of androcentrism. There's obvious. It is blatant. It is
And
obvious.
yes, yes.
However, there are in the Middle East as well some areas where there's a lot of gynocentrism as well. And whenever it comes to like the sexual abuse of like boys as well, because that also happens in the Middle East. So it's very, very like it happens on both sides. But the bad part about it is with this, thinking that, men are just not letting like young boys into these domestic violence shelters for women because, these are young boys, they need protection as well, is very, very is on the back end very harmful for women as well.
yeah. It's interesting that they don't really seem to care that this is hurting women. I mean, like they might not care about the boys and the men, but you'd think they'd at least care about the women that they pretend to care about, but they really don't seem to. I mean, this is hurting everybody. I mean, it's primarily hurting young boys, but it is hurting everybody.
And can I also bring up something else that's a little bit off topic but kind of makes sense?
Go on.
I want to talk about sex trafficking amongst boys, because there's not enough shelters and there's not enough centers for them as well.
I think that's absolutely related, because what
Yeah.
do you think happens to the abused boys who don't have a home? They end up
Yeah.
in being trafficked for work or something worse.
Yeah, and there's not enough shelters for them either. There's not enough places for them either. There's not enough. There's only, will I admit that there's not enough for girls as well? Yes, there's never enough resources for people that are bought and that are abused and that are hurt and that have been treated in the worst possible way. However, the fact that there is on one side, for one demographic, that there is this obvious neglect absolutely is appalling to me. And so we need to, because here's the thing, boys that were in those abusive situations are actually hotbeds for is actually a hotbed for sex traffickers, because here's the thing, a lot of the times, when luring, boys in for that, they will use females to do so, because they will use females that, say that they're going to be like a strong, parental figure, if that, if you know what I mean, like a strong sort of parental figure that's going to take care of them. And most of the time it's women that are obviously abusers, that are obviously predators, and that think that the young boys that are bought, they think that, they're getting a strong maternal figure, when no, they're getting the most abusive women around them and the most predatory women around them. And that is bad.
Yeah, a lot of the times the traffickers are they're headed by women, and they are women. People just don't suspect women of crimes. So if you are a woman and you want to be a criminal, then it's very, very easy for you.
Because according to a theory that was made, it takes a couple of seconds longer for men to perceive women as a threat. There's a theory out there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've heard men saying that they were proud that they didn't hit back against a woman who was hitting them and things like that. It's it's kind of tragic, but it's just another factor in this long train of misery that we have to talk about, because nobody else will. And I think I honestly think that this is something that was known about from the very beginning, because Erin Pizzey, her first shelter, the very first women's shelter that she created, the first volunteer in it was a man. And they had special programs for boys. They had all kinds of things. And it was like a mini community. And if she hadn't been dethroned, if she hadn't been chucked out of her own shelter, and if it hadn't turned into the monstrous ideological mess which is Refuge today, then honestly, we would be living in a much better culture. It would be a better society. There would be less crime. There'd be perceptibly less crime. It's kind of shocking how much damage they've done purely because of their ideological agenda. And they won't admit it. They won't they won't praise Erin Pizzey for starting the first shelter. Erin Pizzey should have a day. Like, she should have a day dedicated to her.
Yes, Aaron Pizzy Day. Oh,
Yeah.
and then it should be right after my birthday.
But yes, she should have a day, and she should be by all accounts, she should be held up by the feminist movement as one of their greats. She should be celebrated on International Women's Day. I mean, we're actually going to celebrate her on International Women's Day. We're going to be celebrating
she should be
female MRAs
celebrated
and people
on
like that.
Yeah, she should be celebrated on International Men's Day as well, because she advocated for men and their abuse and their domestic violence as well.
Yeah, she realized that a lot of the women in her shelter were the abusers, or at least they were equally as abusive as the men. And so she decided to start a men's shelter too. And that's when all hell broke loose. And guns got involved, and she was driven out of the country, and there were bomb threats. And the police were terrified that she was going to be murdered, and it was not a great thing. But at the same time, she's also being censored and deplatformed. But people think deplatforming is a new thing. It is absolutely not. Erin Pizzey was deplatformed back in the 70s. They wouldn't publish her articles. They wouldn't take her calls. They locked her out. And so it's a miracle anyone even knows who she is anymore, because they've just tried to erase her so thoroughly. I mean, the BBC have actually had her on recently on radio to talk about women's shelters, but they neglect to mention what feminism did to her and stuff like that. They probably cut those bits out, because knowing Erin, she probably would have said quite a bit about it. But and now the feminists won't give her the time of the day, and it's MRAs who have to save up to buy her a car and stuff like that, and try to make sure her her working retirement, as it were, is it's kind of awful. I mean, the moment she said that she was in trouble, the whole feminist movement should have been we're going to get Erin a car because she's disabled and she needs help and stuff like that, and she's the mother of the shelter movement. And nope,
they hung her out to dry.
Yeah, I mean, by all accounts, she should be quite rich. At least she should have been given quite a lot of money. She probably would have used it to build shelters and things, but she should have had plenty of money given to her by feminism and stuff like that. But no, she lives in borderline poverty.
If only people were compensated relative to their importance.
Yeah, if only. So, well, that's depressing, I think. It's been a bit of a depressing episode, but I think that's pretty much covered it. If anyone wants to raise another topic related to this, or has anything else to add, then please do. Otherwise, we might take this into free talk time.
I just want to say really fast. I actually, if I can go really quickly, I actually think this episode was very depressing, but I think that what we just did today was an example of real journalism. I mean, we looked at that.
You're roboting.
Sorry about that. So I think that what we did today is we covered something very, very important, and something that does not get covered enough. And yes, it's ugly and it's depressing, but it needs to be talked about. And people like us need to talk about it, because there's nobody else talking about this issue. And this is something that affects children. So I think this was a really, really excellent. But I mean, I covered that needs to be talked about. And I think that, what we did was painful and but necessary.
Blue's cutting out a bit, but yeah, it was painful, but it was necessary. Dark, if you could take us out, please. It's probably a good time because I think the signal's getting worse a bit.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming to the Men Human Rights Discord server Friday chat. We're here every Friday, 4 p.m. UK time, 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central. Please message Ma or myself or Blue if you ever have recommendations for topics. We're always willing to listen. And thank you all for coming. This has been a great chat.